Greetings. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, at this pivotal moment in U.S.-Russia relations, we're joined now by the Academy Award-winning filmmaker Oliver Stone, one of Hollywood's best-known directors. His films have included Platoon, JFK, Wall Street, and Born on the 4th of July. Over the past 2 years, Stone conducted more than 20 hours of interviews with Russian President Vladimir Putin, covering issues from NATO to the nuclear arms race, the NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden, and the 2016 U.S. election. Showtime is airing a four-part special this week called The Putin Interviews. This is an excerpt.
But you do realize how powerful your answer could be if you said subtly that you preferred X candidate. He would go like that tomorrow. And if you say you didn't like Trump or something, right, what would happen? He'd win, right? You have that amount of power in the U.S.
Unlike many partners of ours, we never interfere with the domestic affairs of other countries. This is one of the principles we stick to in our work.
Thank you, sir. We'll see you tomorrow. Talk about some heavier stuff.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. All the best. See you tomorrow.
Good night, sir.
Bye-bye.
That's an excerpt from Oliver Stone's new Showtime series, The Putin Interviews. Oliver Stone is also releasing a companion book compiling the transcripts of his 20 hours of interviews with Vladimir Putin. Oliver Stone joins us here in studio for the rest of the hour. Welcome back to Democracy Now! It's good to have you with us. There is a lot to talk about here and a number of clips we want to play.
Yeah.
But
can I just say that clip, by the way, is from before the election. It was shot on 2015. That was his attitude about and he said things before the election, also very polite and never anything bad-mouthing any of the candidates. He's always been, and he made it very clear back then. I just want to, because we come back to see him after the election in the 4th chapter.
And that's very interesting. This series, first 2 ran this week. They'll continue to run. And then tonight, the 3rd, and tomorrow, the 4th. Right. And it's in that 4th hour where you really get into, because you've returned February 2017, just a few months ago. It's after the election. It's after Donald Trump becomes president. Right. And you really move in on asking him about whether the Russian government hacked the 2016 election. Talk about his response.
Oh, you want to cut right to that part of it because it has to do with Washington today. Believe me, we didn't see this coming, and we never expected we'd have to go back for a 4th trip because we all thought Ms. Clinton was going to win. So I'm sure he did too. I'm sure he did too. I think he was as surprised as any one of us. But as he says in the 4th version, he says, we'll work with anybody. We will work with anybody. It's not our policy to intervene, certainly not a country as big as America. And, you know, it's not influenceable in that sense. I think money influences elections. You could say Mr. Koch, the Koch brothers, perhaps. You could say Sheldon Adelson, people like this do add up. You could say all these lobbies add up. AIPAC adds up. But, you know, Russia's influence. I was wrong. You see, when I looked at that clip, I was thinking, you know, I don't think he has that kind of influence. I think I was putting him on a bit and saying, I'm encouraging him to take a position. That's what an interviewer does sometimes. You exaggerate. But I don't think he could make a difference if he said he hated Trump.
But you get into that issue of the elections and the hacking of the elections. Yes. Sure, all of the different forces that you just described affect elections. But you drill down on this issue of did Putin, the Russian government, hack the elections?
As I said, he denies it completely. I mean, without even, he thinks it's a silly thing. It's an internal American political struggle, and he has a point. I also went into extensively, if you remember, right after that, into cyber warfare, because cyber warfare is a new form of it. We talked about this when I was here for Snowden, in depth, actually. Snowden revealed cyber warfare to us. So much is happening on that front. And one thing he did express very strongly is the Russians have proposed a treaty, a cyber treaty to the United States. It's been on the desk for about a year now, and he has no response from the U.S. He would like one. I think we need one, and we can talk about that too if you want. It's very dangerous, cyber warfare, because of all the rumors and the easy easy to mislead, misinformation, fingerprints, the thin evidence that's presented. It's very possible now with the CIA and Julian Assange, when the Vault 7 leaks a few weeks ago, you covered them, I believe. It was clear that a company like the CIA could, in fact, forge the footprints of any country onto any hack and make it look like they planted the malware.
I wanted to ask you if you've been surprised by the level of animosity toward this project of yours by some of the media, and I saw the Colbert segment that was really an attempt to really go after you in an uncharacteristic way, even for Colbert. But because there is a long history in the United States of journalists trying to get interviews. I think of Barbara Walters with Fidel Castro. I think of going back even Edgar Snow, Red Star over China. Going behind the lines of Mao Zedong and providing positive assessments of what was going on in China. And Wilfred Burchett. Wilfred Burchett did many stories behind the lines in the liberated areas of South Vietnam, interviewing the South Vietnamese leaders because these journalists felt it was necessary for the American people to see the other side. So I'm wondering why this one is, this time around, they've been really blasting you.
Well, listen, you go back in American history. We did Untold History with you, too, and we talked about this bias against Russia since 1917. I mean, we didn't even recognize Red Russia until 1933 with Roosevelt. He was the first one to build any kind of, and he was the best. He believed in an alliance, a grand alliance after the war with Russia, the U.S., England, and China. And if he'd lived a few more months, I think it would have been a completely different framework for the world. I think Harry Truman had a more limited view. We talked about this too, but Russia, the bias against Russia, they did it. It goes to Ian Fleming novels, to James Bond, the feeling that Smersh is behind it, or Mr. Putin has been characterized in a cartoonish way as a Dr. No figure. You don't go there. And I'm surprised because Americans should really, if they think of him as this threat to America, our generals say they're the #1 existential threat to the United States. If you believe that, then you should know more about them and who their leader is and what they're actually saying, because they don't print that. I don't see him speaking to American people in our language. I mean, he's always interpreted with a bad dub, generally speaking, with a harsh voice, a football voice or something, like a football coach's voice. This is a chance to hear him in his own language. I think the interpreter is very good. He speaks softly, firmly, but softly.
Well, you don't put a translator over him. You have you have subtitles, so that makes an enormous
harmony
difference.
there. And I think after, I'm a filmmaker. I'm approaching it not as a newsman, so I see it as a 4-hour project. And in those 4 hours, you will cover it from 2000 all the way up to 2016. How
did you end up doing this?
By accident, kind of. I was doing the Snowden movie in Germany, and we were communicating a lot with Ed. He lived in Moscow at the time, and we were going there, still is, I'm sorry, not at the time. And we were going there talking to him, and at one of those 9 times I went over there, I met Mr. Putin for the first time. I knew Mr. Gorbachev and, another world. I knew the old Russia, but I didn't know Mr. Putin. And he clarified, I asked him about Snowden, and he was, as in the film, he clarified the Russian position on him.
Well, let's turn to a clip from the Putin interviews where you ask him about Edward Snowden, the NSA whistleblower who was given asylum nearly 2 years ago in Russia.
Let me ask you, I'm sure you must have, as an ex-KGB agent, you must have hated what Snowden did with every fiber of your being.
No, not at all. Snowden is not a traitor. He didn't betray the interest of his country, nor did he transfer any information to any other country which would have been pernicious to his own country or to his own people. The only thing Snowden does, he does publicly.
Did you agree with what he did?
No.
Did you think the National Security Agency had gone too far in its eavesdropping?
Yes, certainly. In that matter, Snowden was right. But you asked me, and I gave you a direct answer. I think he shouldn't have done it. If he didn't like anything at his work, he should have simply resigned. But he went further. That's his right. But since you are asking whether it's right or wrong, I think it's wrong.
мое мнение нет, неправильно.
So he's saying that he should not have whistleblown, and he should have resigned in principle, on the principle, like Mr. Putin did when he resigned from the KGB.
Пожалуй, да.
Yes, I think so. I had not given it thought, but I think yes.
Я подал в отставку в связи с тем, что я не...
I resigned because I didn't agree with the actions undertaken by the government.
Попытка государственного переворота. И не хотел оставаться в рядах спецслужбы в это время.
Okay, so you do agree that the NSA went too far.
Да.
Yes.
And how do you feel about Russian intelligence activities in their surveillance?
Я думаю, что они работают хорошо.
I think they're working quite well.
Наши спецслужбы
Our
работают.
intelligence services always conform to the law.
Это первое.
That's the first thing. And secondly, trying to spy on your allies. If you really consider them allies and not vassals,
А не вассалами, это
is just indecent because it undermines trust.
Undermines trust.
а значит,
And it means that in the end it deals damage to your own national security.
Deals damage to your
Was President Putin talking with you, Oliver, about the NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden, who's actually been in Russia now for 4 years, not 2, as I said earlier. But I wanted
We
to
should
ask you,
point out that he's driving.
Yes, well, I wanted to say that. Yeah, for those who are only listening on radio, the video is with him driving a car and you the passenger. Now, I have to assume that the security on the outside of the car, which the camera didn't show, must have been fantastic, to be able to have the president of Russia driving a car down a street.
The people have noticed that. They've asked me questions like, how come he doesn't crash? If how does he concentrate like this? But he likes driving. He likes to be in charge this way. And what president do you see driving around the streets? He's a judoka. He's an athlete. He likes to get behind things. He drive things, ski. He took up skating at the age of 62. He took up hockey, which is a rough sport. And we show you a hockey game. He likes competition. He likes the challenge. He was a master, apparently, at judo. Still does it every morning. He works out 7 days a week. It's interesting, what he says about KGB activity, and he talks about allies, and that was a big point of his. You don't go after allies. He makes it again in another chapter that they don't listen in on allies. It's quite normal, he says, to have the U.S. and Russia going at it, and China, but never don't. And I think that was a shock, if you remember, when Snowden's news came out, that we were doing this to Japan. We were planning malware in Japan. We put that in the movie. That we were listening in on Angela Merkel or Dilma Rousseff in Brazil. It's pretty shocking stuff.
But what about the issue of his repression of Russian society, of protesters, of journalists? And what was your sense of his response to those questions?
We go there. I mean, probably not to your satisfaction, because he feels differently. One of the arguments he points out is democracy has been only really working in Russia since 1992, when the Federation started with Yeltsin. It was a very bumpy start, if you remember. The United States business crowd moved in, and a lot of privatization went the wrong way, a lot of theft, a lot of corruption. And Yeltsin had a very rocky second election in '96. His numbers were very low. It was the United States that supported Yeltsin with an IMF loan and a lot of behind-the-scenes activity to get him in. A lot of Russians don't feel he did not win the '96 election. So they had a rough start on democracy. It was Putin that really actually stabilized the system, the society, and gave it this form that it has now, which we don't like, and we've been criticizing it. But he argues very strongly that there's laws in Russia, and there's evidence of it. There's a Duma, there's people who get elected. There is a system. There are other parties. It may not meet our satisfaction, but you can be heard unless you're calling for the overthrow of the state, which is always...
Or if you're a critical journalist, then you might be killed.
Well, we don't know exactly what... As to evidences, we don't have any on that. There was the famous case of Anna Politskaya, and frankly, from what I've been told by people who know a lot more about than I do, is, her family knows, her family as well as her editor don't believe that it was the administration that had anything to do with it. It was much more likely that it was the Chechen terrorist leaders. She was writing very tough stuff about Chechnya.
On the issue of Edward Snowden, it's interesting. He says he does not agree with him. Yes, they've granted political asylum, and it's important just because it's repeated so often the other way to say that Edward Snowden did not choose to live in Russia. He had his passport yanked by the U.S. when he was flying from Hong Kong, only transiting through Russia, so ended up there. And then Putin granted him political asylum. But interesting that President Putin actually does not agree with what Snowden did as a former KGB guy.
He says that very clearly. He says he should have gone through channels, that he should have resigned. I don't know that he understands fully our system and how difficult it is for a person to work inside that system and say anything. And, you know, in other words, Putin, I know that Mr. Snowden did it for conscience and for his own conscience. I think that's one of the great stories. That's why I made the movie.
And you're talking about the feature film you did on Snowden as opposed to these 4 hours of interviews that
well, this is him. I'm not making judgments here, and I'm not arguing back. I'm not going to change his mind. What I'm going to do to hopefully is show his mind to people who are interested in knowing what we're talking about, because he receives so much criticism here. You know, you have to balance it with something. You have to listen.
Well, I thought one of the most fascinating parts in the interviews was the understanding of his perspective of how, when Russia came out, when the Soviet Union collapses and the Gorbachev period and the Yeltsin period, that he felt that the predatory nature of the capitalism that first came into Russia was something that had to be opposed, and that in essence that he felt that he basically told the capitalists, look, you guys are out of control. You know, the pension systems, the conditions of the people have gotten too. They cannot be sustained this way. And so he attempted essentially to curb the most rapacious form of capitalism.
Absolutely true. That's why he's popular, because he did it. He not only put Russian economy back on its feet, he got income back to the people. He was, in a sense, a populist dictator at that point, because I wouldn't even say dictator, he was an authoritarian. But he got that economy going, and they're thankful. Now, things change. It's been 16 years off and on. He's been president 3 times, prime minister 1 time. But they like his resilience, and they feel, even Mr. Gorbachev, who was very critical of him early on, says that he's the man for now, because everyone in Russia understands the pressure the United States is bringing, and NATO is bringing on the borders of Russia.
You had this conversation right at that time after World War II where he talks about, well, he refers to the United States as our partners, and he says he thinks that the Soviets made a mistake in forming 2, what does he say, polar camps.
Yeah, I disagree with him. I understand why, but I was surprised he said that.
But he seems to be critical of communism, and you also ask him.
I think he was more critical of it than I was, yes, definitely.
And you say to him, are you the richest man in the world, as some people say?
Yeah. No, I think he thinks that's a pretty silly question. Let's put it this way. He may have some money that I don't know about. He may have been corrupt early on in some ways. Maybe but I didn't see evidence of it in the sense of his lifestyle or his thought process. He is a man who works 12 hours a day, and we had a long discussion about materialism, and he made it very clear that he lives by another standard. And I think it's a devotion to Russia, the national interests of Russia, and I think he has a strong dose of spirituality in him. The Russian Eastern Church, very important to him. He wasn't he who led it back into its popularity. It was the people who took it up again because there was a void after communism.
Well, in this clip from the Putin interviews, Vladimir Putin talks about NATO. You mentioned NATO before.
There's a funny clip when I'm in the church and I said, where do you pray? And he said, you don't pray kneeling down in Russia.
So let's go to that clip.
It has only vassals. Once a country becomes a NATO member, it is hard to resist the pressure of the U.S. And all of a sudden, any weapon system can be placed in this country. An anti-ballistic missile system, new military bases, and if need be, new offensive systems. And what are we supposed to do? In this case, we have to take countermeasures. We have to aim our missile systems at facilities that are threatening us. the situation becomes more tense. Why are we so acutely responding to the expansion of NATO? Well, as a matter of fact, we understand the value, or lack thereof, and the threat of this organization. But what we're concerned about is the following. We are concerned by the practice of how decisions are made. I know how decisions are taken there. I remember one of our last meetings with President Clinton in Moscow. During the meeting, I said we would consider an option, that Russia might join NATO. Clinton said, why not? But the U.S. delegation got very nervous.
NATO, your summation of that.
13 countries have joined NATO since Clinton made this, I think, rash decision to expand it to the east. That was not the promise made by Baker and the senior Bush to Gorbachev. Gorbachev swears to this. It was not put on paper. This is one of the reasons that Putin is upset with Gorbachev as a practical man, as a politician. It should have been on paper, but it wasn't. So they see Gorbachev as acting out of weakness, and as a result, the whole Soviet Union collapsed very quickly. And 25 million people, roughly, were left outside the old borders and with new countries, without the protection of the Soviet Union. Their pensions and so forth not met. And then, of course, the internal system collapsed. So it was an ugly time, and the Second Chechen War broke out. You know, we talked about NATO, but NATO is a huge problem for them, not for us. And a lot of the people who are in NATO now are very anti-Russian, Eastern countries, and anything can happen. An accident like in Dr. Strangelove could happen very, very easily.
And we're going to get to his response to Dr. Strangelove in a minute.
Yeah.
He even says he'd like to join NATO.
Well, he was kind of joking, and he was, no, what was surprising about it was Clinton's quick response. Why not? You know, that's the way Clinton used to kind of act. And when the delegation heard that, their faces dropped. They didn't want Russia in NATO because NATO they'd have a veto. Mm-hmm. And he makes the point that none of these countries in NATO have ever said no to the United States positions. Never. Which is, he says, vassals. They're not allies, they're vassals. It's interesting.
One of the things that came across to me was also the command of detail and the thought processes that he goes through when you're asking questions. It's clear that, as you mentioned at one point, that he reads the actual reports, not summaries. And you compare him to President Obama, who did the same thing, that he never got his intelligence summaries. He actually read the actual reports to make up his own mind. Yeah. So there's really a hands-on approach to his governance of the country.
He's a CEO who kicks the tires. He really works too hard. I was worried about his health, 16 years of this. I said, why don't you act more like Reagan and have some fun, eat jelly beans, and smile more, people would appreciate it. He understands the value of that, but it's not his style.
We're going to go to a break and then come back to more of the Putin interviews. Our guest is the 3-time Academy Award-winning director and screenwriter, Oliver Stone. Stay with us.